There you are, you see. Let's hope that works out. So, fairly broad and discursive talk with help and input from an awful lot of people, including my colleagues Julia Hockenmeyer and Derek Hoyam, with input from Tamara, from Pinard Dougalou, from Quibus Barnard, from Ali Fahadi, Ian Andres, Amin Sadehi, Binbin Liao, Yang Wang, Varsha Hedar, Kevin Kosh, Gang Wang, and Nicholas Love. So lots of people I've stolen slides from or have contributed things. And I'm going to talk very generally about visual object recognition and why you might do it and how you might do it. Why would you care? Well, if you want to act in the world, you have to draw distinctions between things. Can I run it over or should I not run it over? Can I bump into it or not bump into it? Is the ground soggy? If I move forward, will my wheels get stuck or my feet get stuck? Is that person over there doing something dangerous? Is it dangerous to me? Which end of that animal is the dangerous end? And then if you think about sort of information systems, then recognition can unlock value in pictures. You can search for things, you can find things, you can sell things, you can cluster them and order them. There is a general engineering point here, which is if you had really neat object recognition procedures, you could tell what people are doing. And that is useful in an immense number of general engineering ways. So there can't be people in this room who haven't heard in some way of the Connect, for example. There might be people who don't realize it's the third technology in that, the third commercial technology in that line, and in fact about the fifth technology. So the aim of allowing people to run up and down in their living room and thereby control avatars who are machine gunning aliens has been going on since the early 90s, and people have been really trying to get that effective. That's a recognition technology. Another thing that I use as an argument here, pretty much anything that has vision has some sort of recognition system. It may not be a great one. There are all sorts of funny stories about the recognition system of various crabs and how it goes wrong. But always things with vision have recognition systems. Okay, so one nice example is the applications of recognition to humans. So everybody will be aware of surveillance applications. You hang a camera, you look at some area and you decide that person is doing a dangerous thing, or it's after midnight and there's somebody in the classified photocopier room and that shouldn't happen, or something of that sort. But there are other applications. So here's one surveillance thing. NSF has just given a bunch of money to lots of vision people, lots of other sensor people, to look at screening children for autism spectrum disorder. Right? Now, here, this is a disorder where if you get it very early in life, outcomes are better. And what you really want to do is screen all 1- and 2-year-olds, or all 2- and 3-year-olds, so that the ones who need to see somebody who knows what they're doing can be identified. It's not a computer system to say this kid is sick. It's a computer system to say it's a good idea that this kid sees somebody who knows what they're doing. And the general idea is you observe kids behaving naturally, possibly with cameras, with microphones, with physiological sensors, and then you say, gee, something funny is going on here. The child's attention isn't switching enough. There's some movement that's funny. Somebody who knows what they're doing should see them. And that's fundamentally a recognition problem. I'm, if you like, regressing this immense amount of data against scores that human screeners have for people, and I'm trying to predict those scores. I pinched this slide from Tamara, but this is one of the core driving things of recent recognition, which is words near pictures are informative. So this is an e-commerce slide. We've got a bunch of pictures from catalogs. And what we'd like to do is to make it easier to find things that people want. Why? Because they spend billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars on things on the web. Now, if you notice, these pictures have distorted the words nearby. It's fairly clear that these words refer to pictures. It's fairly clear these pictures are referred to by these words, but you'll notice some details are missing from the words because they're obvious in the picture. This seems like a really comprehensive description of this dress, but it leaves out one crucial fact, which is that the dress is black. Why? Because it's agonizingly obvious from the picture, and there's no point in mentioning it. So there are several things that you might want to do. One is you might want to take these pairs of pictures and words and generate even more comprehensive descriptions. Another is you might want to take these pairs and learn methods to generate the textual descriptions or something like the textual descriptions from the pictures. And yet another thing you might want to do is to study the ways in which pictures nearby distort the structure of words. You'll notice, by the way, that that missing black is true for all of these. It's quite common. There's some things that are just so painfully obvious in the picture, they're never mentioned in the words. Okay, so when I talk, I always sort of start with conclusions because then they give a structure to the talk and we'll sort of plug through the conclusions. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make the point that while recognition is subtle, we have a ton of strong basic methods, all of which are sort of based around classifiers and which work and are really useful. And then we'll move on and talk about coming technologies and open questions. Here's the basic recipe. If you understand this recipe, you understand features, and you understand how to build classifiers, you can build moderately good detection and recognition systems. For some reason, I got the figure upside down, I think because it just fixed. But the recipe is basically this. I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to make bigger and smaller versions of the picture. In a fixed size version of the picture, I will look at each of a fixed size window. Then I will do some feature computation stuff. And there are two ways to do it. One is the way I've drawn it over here, which is I correct the illumination and I estimate the orientation of the object I'm looking at. The other I could do is I could just compute features where this didn't matter. Now I have some features and I stick those features in a classifier. And the job of the classifier is to say, this window is a face, this one isn't. If I want to find faces that are bigger, then I look for the same size window in smaller versions of the image. Right? Why? Because it's much more efficient than looking for bigger versions of the window in the fixed size version of the image. And I can look in an even smaller image for larger versions of the face. Now when I do that, what will happen is if I have a picture with, say, two faces in it, and faces are kind of the classic for this recipe, but it's used for lots of other things as well, then because these windows will overlap each other, I'll get a bunch of strong responses from the classifier which say, I think there's a face here, 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 and here. There are not 53 faces almost directly on top of each other, so I need to do something in this neighborhood to decide what is there and then suppress everything else. And that's called non-maximum suppression. It is something of a black box, and later on we'll look inside the box and interesting things will result. But generally what I do is I take the biggest over here and then say, if there's a face here, there can't be any other one nearby, and I suppress all of those and go on. This recipe is amazingly successful. Over the last 10 years, an enormous number of people have made a living out of variants on this recipe. You can fiddle around with the feature construction, you can have glorious fun looking up classifiers nobody else has ever heard of, and replacing them, and you can fiddle a little bit with the non-maximum thing. And it leads to a way of doing research which has been very powerful. You go out and you get a data set. You build some features which need to be like other people's features because that means they'll work well, but they need to be different because you want to get it published. You do some sort of messing around with classifiers and probability, and that produces a representation. There's a face here, a face here, a face here. And that recipe is valuable and powerful. Some of it probably isn't terribly interesting, and some of it is very interesting. And I'll try and focus on the interesting bits. The first interesting bit is, how should we represent the signal? What should we really represent about the image? And that kind of comes under the build features part of the recipe. The second really interesting bit is, what should the output look like? So if I've got a picture and I do recognition, what's the result? Right? And then in the middle here, there's some aspects of model. What should we represent? What should we know? Is it important to know the geometry in which objects live, for example, that we'll talk about? The bit where you mess around with classifiers and probability is essentially light entertainment. It's very easy to do, it's very well established, and as I say, it's light entertainment. We know how it works. So on the features side, for the kind of recognition and detection I'm talking about, there now is an established solution which is quite useful. There are two principles on the solution. One is the features should be invariant to illumination changes, or at least robust to them. And that says use image gradient orientations. The other is that as I sweep this window, I am going to place the window in slightly the wrong place on top of the object I'm looking for. And that means I should not be asking for a particular gradient orientation in a particular spot. Instead, I should be asking about the local trends of gradient orientation, and I should build some class of local histogram. And that means, in turn, that I get a feature that looks a bit like this. So here's an image window of this woman pushing apparently 2 bicycles. And then in each little block of the image window, I'm going to build a histogram of the orientations of the gradients. And I can plot that histogram with a little rose diagram. So this diagram means there are lots of horizontal and relatively few verticals. And then there's one up there that I can't reach, where there are lots of things at this diagonal and few others. And if you look at this diagram, you can see there's a bunch of structure associated with this person that is visible in the features. There's a bunch of vertical structure associated with this hanging traffic cone. And here's sort of a classic example from Deva Ramanan's slides, where here's a bicycle, and this is what these features, which are usually referred to as hog features. Much of the construction is the same as sift features. There are all sorts of tiny little variants. You can really pretty much see the bicycle in this histogram. And you take this thing, straighten it out into a vector, and then bung it into whatever classifier you particularly care to be associated with. And that's the recipe. We won't talk much more about features, but I want to say this recipe works fairly well for classification and detection. So right now, if you have, this slide is sort of fairly recent things. If you have 101 categories of objects, and you do enough fiddling around with features and enough studying, you'll notice that the same data set has been used by lots of people over a period of time, which is a slightly worrying thing, as we'll see later on. You can get, with enough training examples, you can get nearly 80% of classification attempts right, counted the right way. And if you had 256, you could get nearly 50% of classification attempts right. This is moderately good. I showed the slide to a bunch of robotics people last week, and they said, oh, no, but we need to get 99% right. And the answer to that one is you'll have to wait. Look at the trends on the curve. Things have been getting a lot better. They'll get better still. You know, it's basically sort of under control. And classification works well for really quite unpromising things. So Laptev and Perez and Schmidt built a system where you go to the web, you collect the scripts of movies. Those scripts have been time aligned by enthusiasts on the internet who do all sorts of interesting things. You collect those time aligned scripts in the movies, and whenever you see a term describing a human action in the script, then you find that piece of movie and you regard it as aligned, and then you use that pair of the action name and the little piece of text as data to train, the action name and the piece of movie nearby as data to train a classifier. And if you followed what I said about orientations, the set of features you would use are fairly obvious. Now you've got orientations in space as well as time. There are a couple more angles. You make slightly more complicated histograms. It all works out. If you do that, you can build classifiers that will spot really very complicated actions in movies. So I've got things like answer the phone, get out of the car, handshake, hug a person, kiss, sit down, sit up, stand up. Top row shows true positives. Middle row shows true negatives. They really aren't answering the phone, and the system knows they're not answering the phone. This is a false positive. If you look closely enough at this picture, this guy looks as though he's leaning on a bed and answering a phone, but he isn't actually. Right? And so it's a false positive, and that's a false negative. He really is answering a phone, but it didn't spot him. And these kinds of actions you can spot really quite well. we can build our detectors from this recipe work well as well. There's a mild extra complexity that you have to add to get good detectors, which is you allow local parts to move around. I've suppressed that in this talk because, as I said, it's just a mild extra complexity. But here are examples of detectors. Each row shows a different kind of thing being detected. The top row is people, the middle row is bottles, the bottom row is cars. The first three show true positives. The little blue boxes are the box that contains the person or the bottle or the car. The little yellow boxes are local parts, which, as I say, I've suppressed. So up here, I've got a single person crossing a railway line, and he's been identified. Then in the next picture, I've got a whole group of people, which in fact has been counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's been counted right. Okay, so we've got 5 little blue boxes in the right place on 5 people. On the third one, there's somebody behind a bush. And that person has been spotted because their head and upper body is really, really distinctive. And it doesn't matter that the legs are missing. And then the fourth one, you know, as my old colleague Robert Walensky used to say, it's bloody at the cutting edge. You don't get it all right. And that's all there is to it. Bottle detectors work really well as well. Not all of these bottles got detected, but many of them. That's a bottle. That's a bottle. Bottle detectors and people detectors get mixed up. Why? Because that process looks for distinctive curves that identify objects. People are identified by the head and shoulders curve, which looks the same as what you see in bottles. So there's a traditional mix-up between people and bottle detectors, which is a nuisance. Car detectors work fine at different scales, using that trick I described of using bigger or smaller images. And as a mix-up, marking a bus as a car is not tragic. So, you know, this is sort of moderately usable technologies. Okay, all of this illustrates a kind of belief space about object recognition, which has come to fruition and is now largely beginning to run out of steam. And the belief is that objects belong to fixed and known categories, and each instance of an object belongs to just one category. Right? This is fairly obvious nonsense. This could be a cup, but it could also be a projectile. If you doubt the second categorization, I'll throw it at someone, and then it will be a projectile, right? There are all sorts of categories that a single instance can belong to, and those categories are not intrinsic. They're associated with what you do with them. But in this view, we believe these things, and then we say, well, recognition is K-way classification, and research is basically, let's figure out features, let's figure out classifiers, and do better at it. And it turns out this has been very generous to us as a way of thinking about a problem, but it's not perfect. So here's one example. Are these monkeys? Okay, so the usual reaction of audiences to my questions is to look baffled because they know there's a hook coming, but they can't figure out what the hook is. And sticking your neck out is not a good idea. Are they monkeys? Most audiences say, yeah, they're monkeys, right? Now, depending on what you want, they are or are not monkeys. So the first 3 are clearly monkeys. The third, the fourth are apes. I checked. Baboons are, in fact, monkeys, taxonomically. That's an ape, that's an ape, that's an ape. That one at the end there is an ape. That's a little plastic toy. Right? Now, the point about this is not that I can be more finicky than you can about taxonomy. The point is that category depends on context and what you're trying to do. It's entirely legitimate to think of this as a monkey. It's also entirely legitimate to think of it as a little plastic toy. For some purposes, that's a monkey. But if you were a primatologist and you called that a monkey, nobody would ever speak to you again because it's fairly obviously an ape. So the nature of categories is somewhat fluid, and it depends a bit on what you're doing and what you mean. But we've inherited a great deal from this worldview of object recognition I described. So we know a lot about feature constructions. I've suppressed most of it because some of it's just detail and some of it was summarized in that slide. But we really know how to build good features. We know a lot about how to build classifiers and what they do. And we're really good at doing experiments, which is hard. Right? We collect very big data sets, we classify them well and the like. But to do this, we've suppressed a lot of subtlety. And most of what I'm going to talk about is the subtlety. So we've suppressed things like unfamiliar objects. What do you say about unfamiliar objects? What kind of things should we recognize? What knowledge of the environment helps? What should we say about pictures at the end of the day? and how does utility affect what we say? And I'm going to talk mainly about those subtleties. So we'll start with the unfamiliar. Now, if you watch this movie sequence, you probably don't know what this person is doing, or you don't have a name for it, but at the same time, it's highly unlikely that you found the movie baffling. You might ask, why would you do that? But it's fine, you don't need a name, you've seen it before, you can cope. And that would be true with this as well, which is probably something you haven't seen before. In fact, almost certainly something you haven't seen before. Somewhere around about now, the structure of the narrative and what's going on should be completely obvious. And in fact, even the donkey knows what's happening because it's pretty relaxed about the whole thing. And what you should take from these kind of movies is you're really not baffled by things you haven't seen before. Everything's fine, they're back in business, there's no problem. Things you haven't seen before are easy to cope with. Now, the recipe I described to you doesn't really have room for that. The reason it doesn't really have room for that is it says things that fit into my system of categories I know about and I can remark on, things that don't, well, the hell with them. And that's just not consistent with the evidence. There has been a recent fashion for thinking about describing objects in terms of things we call attributes, which is a term that is fortunately extremely difficult to define, so we can be a bit vague. And the argument says instead of taking this image and saying bird, what I should do is take my features as before and then build classifiers. But instead of building classifiers that say bird, I should build classifiers that say it's got a beak, it's got an eye, it's got a foot, it's got feathers, that sort of thing. Because if I do that, then when I run into a picture I've never seen before, I may not be able to say bird because I don't know what category it belongs to. But I can produce some descriptive information. So I can cope with the unfamiliar, at least in one way. And with such systems, you can demonstrate things like this. So over here, what we have are windows in images of objects of a type or of a category that do not exist in the training process. These are test images, but they're tests of things that do not appear in the training set. And these are representations that are produced. So this particular monkey, there are no monkeys in the training set, says it's whatever it is, I don't know what it is, but it's got a head, it's got an ear, it's got a snout, it's got a nose, and it's got a mouth. For this zebra, it says, I don't know what it is, but it's got a tail, a snout, and a leg, and it's got text on it, and it's made of plastic. Again, these are fairly obviously wrong. Why does it say it's got text on it? Because text consists of little vertical bars. Why does it say it's made of plastic? The very strong contrasts generated by specularities are characteristic of plastic, and zebras have those too. And that means with unfamiliar objects, you can at least say something, and some of what you say is useful. It's genuinely helpful to know that that's boxy, it's got a wheel, it's got a window, it's got some round stuff, and it's got a torso. Right? Even though we don't know what it is. One way in which objects could be unfamiliar is I might actually know what category they belong to, but they might have special properties as a member of that category. So in an architecture like this, another thing that you can do is you can say, okay, well, I'm going to make these predictions with my classifiers, which will have the semantics of beak, eye, foot, whatever. And then also I'll look at those predictions and the other features, and I'll say things like that are birds. Now, if I am confident that this is a bird, but I also notice that it hasn't got an eye, I know something extra. It's not just a bird, it's a special bird, and it's a special bird in an interesting way. So there's a pragmatical argument that suggests that this might be a way that adjectives are chosen. Pragmatic says we say things that are informative, unusual, and correct, which we know can't be absolutely right if we've ever been to meetings. But this gives us a way of thinking about things that are informative because they're unusual and are correct. And we can now say, okay, I can build a detector. And the detector does what I described. It racks out this list of attributes. And then it also says, here's the way in which it's special. So this window is classified as being an aeroplane, but it notices that this aeroplane window is special amongst aeroplane windows because there is no wing. Notice the relatively crude semantics here. No means we don't see one in this window, whereas there are two kinds of no, and that we do not distinguish between. One of them is this is an aeroplane without a wing, and the other is this is an aeroplane whose wing I cannot see. Right now, there's no one who distinguishes between those cases. There's a boat without a sail, which it genuinely doesn't have. An aeroplane without a jet engine, and a car without a door. Now we can argue whether this car has a door or not, but it isn't an obvious door because it's shut. That bird has no tail because you can't see the tail, and this bird has no leg because our detectors aren't that great. Right? The legs are little things down here, and they're just hard to figure out. I love keeping this one in the slide, but it has to be mentioned that it's sheer dumb luck. Right? That is a sheep with no wool, but we just got lucky. That's all there is to it. And you can also say when it's special because it has things you don't expect. So again, you'll notice there's sort of semantic issues here, but this says bird that has extra leaves. The fact that birds can't have extra leaves is just not known, so there's nothing we can do with it. But you could see things that you might do with it. That's a bicycle with horns from the suggestive shape of the handlebars. And there's a dining table over there with skin from the arms of the person sitting at the table. So you'll notice, firstly, that there's some now quite sophisticated object semantics that need to be untangled here. And secondly, that you can make useful statements about ways in which objects are special. Now, what I described to you is still very much a toy system because one provides to that system image windows that want description. It still doesn't work well enough that you can sweep windows across images and make statements. And generally that's because you want the window centered on an object. If I don't know what the object is, it might be very difficult to center the window. And it turns out that that may not in fact be true. There's some evidence appearing in the literature. Ian Andrus has done some work like this, as has Alex and Ferrari, which suggests that some image regions want to be objects. That you can actually segment images into regions, and then take a look at the shape of the regions, the interior of the region, and the like, and without knowing what the object is, say this region is really quite likely to be an object. This region is really quite likely to be an object, and this one, who's the sort of background stuff, really isn't all that likely to be an object. Objects like to be compact, they like to be internally coherent, they like to have contrast on their boundaries, and you can build something discriminative that accepts a region and says, well, yeah, actually there's a pretty good chance there's an object here. And that suggests it might be possible to build systems eventually that will take images, find regions that would really like to be objects, and then say, okay, well, there are feathers in here, there's stripes in here, there's a bunch of other stuff, but I don't really know what that object is. Such systems don't exist yet, but it looks as though they will come. Okay, let's look at the next sort of general point. We'll look at phrases. So one subtlety in the recipe that the recipe I described doesn't handle very well is the question of what is a natural clump of meaning to recognize. Right? So if you look over here, this is a region I cut out, or actually an automated method cut out, from a picture of somebody sledding. And you could describe this with a single word and call it a sledder, although that seems a little bit unnatural. But it really is one thing. And one way I can think about this as being one thing is I could ask, well, if I cut this child off the sled, would the region be better? And the answer is no, it would be moderately incomprehensible. You wouldn't really know why the person was in that configuration. And if you cut the child off the sled and reported the sled, it would also be a little bit puzzling. And if you said, okay, well, actually this is an assembly of parts, and there are feet, and there are hands, and there's a head, and a jacket, and a sled, and you cut them all off in separate pieces, the whole thing would be extremely puzzling. It looks as though it's a single chunk of meaning, which is much more complex than a single object. Right? It's a chunk that belongs together. So what should we recognize? Should we recognize single words or stuff? Well, the answer that we shouldn't necessarily recognize a single object has been known for quite a long time. It can come under the heading of the idea of a scene. We think about scenes as being stages for types of object, and there are numerous scene data sets. So this is the most recent one from Shao et al. The scene data set contains examples of things like a bull ring. Right? Why would you want to call this a bull ring? Because you'd expect to find bulls and matadors in there, but perhaps not dolphins. Right? So you could then take the whole image, compute features, stick it into a classifier, and if the classifier says bull ring, you know what things to look for. And that procedure is established. That can be done with our existing recipe. We know also, we have known for nearly 20 years now, that if you know what a scene is, you have some priors on where the objects are likely to be. So here's an outdoor scene. It's known to be an outdoor scene. And if you take an outdoor scene, then the buildings tend to be on the top part. The street tends to be up and this way. The street tends to be on the lower part. The trees tend to be on the middle and the sides. The sky tends to be on the top, and there can be cars. The top is a prior map on a coarse spatial scale of the locations of the objects, and the bottom is where they exist. So this one doesn't actually have cars in it, but if it did, they might be in these kind of places. If you know that a room is an interior office scene, then you know that the screens are going to be high-ish in the room, the desks are going to be a little lower, and the chairs are going to be a little bit lower. They might not be there, but if they were there, you know good places to look for them. The problem is we don't yet have a well-established notion of something that lives between a scene and an object. And there are two ways this can be useful. One is, if scenes exist, then the words that you predict from images are correlated. Right? Why? Because bulls tend to appear in bull rings and matadors tend to appear with bulls in bull rings, and that means there's some correlation between those words. So you could benefit from this. Imagine I took my recipe and I wanted to predict a lot of words. I know two things. One is I know that some features are not helpful. I just don't know which ones are unhelpful. The other thing I know is that my words are correlated. If I used a linear support vector machine as a classifier, then instead of building one classifier per word, I could build a whole collection of classifiers, which would be a matrix. And then I would have something which said, my classifier, the output table of words is a matrix of classifiers applied to some features. But that matrix of classifiers probably should be factored into two pieces. One piece takes the high-dimensional features onto a low-dimensional good space. The other takes that low-dimensional good space onto long vectors of correlated words. Why are the words correlated? Because the things live in scenes. It turns out with minor changes to learning procedures, you can learn classifiers like this, which are tied to one another through word correlation. And that gives you, actually I'll skip that slide, that gives you something that predicts labels for scenes that are rather better than independent predictions. So over here what I've got is images, and then below them are labels, and the labels are in different colors. The labels are let me see, green if the label was there, but the classifier didn't predict it. You'll notice that doesn't happen very often. Blue if the label was there and the classifier did predict it. And red if it wasn't there, but the classifier predicted it. Why would it predict things that weren't there? Well, people very often leave out labels when they label images. So in a picture like this picture got labeled water, people, pool, and our classifiers predicted water, people, pool. And by the time you've predicted those three, you might as well predict swimmers as well, because they're heavily correlated. And it turns out they're there and the labeler didn't put them there. This process of correlating the words is really quite useful because, so for example, in a case like this, once you've suggested stone, temple, pillar, mosque, there's a decent chance of sculpture, there's a decent chance of buildings, and there's a decent chance of people. So you should predict your words as great clumps. The second line that this suggests is the things you recognize might not necessarily be individual objects. Instead, what we might do is look for chunks of meaning that have two properties. They live somewhere between scenes and objects. So objects are single things. These are composites, but they're not as big as whole scenes. The other thing about them is they're easy to detect and recognize. And it turns out these things appear to exist. We call them visual phrases. That confuses things because there's another use of the term visual phrase. But there you are, you see. It turns out, for example, people riding bicycles are very easy to detect using the recipe I described as chunks. People are very hard to detect. Bicycles are not that easy to detect, but people riding bicycles have relatively low visual complexity, and building a people riding bicycle detector is very successful. In fact, you get, here is a people riding bicycle detector that's worked here, 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 here. The only person detector that fired on an image like this is this one. So all these other people didn't fire the person detector. Why? Because their aspect is pretty special. That's also why it's easy to detect them as people riding a bicycle. Over here, these lads, somebody pointed out I shouldn't be showing these slides because these children are drinking from beer bottles, which is inappropriate or improper or whatever. Person drinking a bottle is monstrously difficult to detect by looking for the two pieces, because you get people and bottles mixed up. Over here, for example, the people detector knows that there are people there. But if you say a person drinking a bottle is a single chunk of meaning, and you train something to detect that, it actually behaves extremely well. So then there's this sort of puzzling question of what are the right chunks of meaning? There's another puzzling and important technical question here. So I went out and I built a person detector with the recipe I described, I built a horse detector with the recipe I described, and I built a person riding a horse detector with the recipe I described. The problem I now have is quite a lot of detectors are going to like this image, and I need to figure out who's right. The person riding a horse detector might like it, but also the person detector might like that person, and who knows, if I'm lucky, the horse detector might like this horse. And I need to figure out which ones agree with each other, which ones contradict each other, and which ones I like. And that leads to a process that we call decoding, where you essentially list out all of the detectors and their responses in this image, and then you look at other detectors that respond near a particular statement, and you say, I am going to believe you, you, and you, but not you and you. If you do this decoding process, or at least the way we've been doing it so far, by the way, the best way to do it is still open. We have a way of doing it, we like it, but, you know, replace it with a better one if you can. If you do this decoding process, then what you'd like to have is the horse detector finds the horses, the person riding horse detector finds the people, and the person detectors find the people as well. Decoding helps. It's not perfect, but it helps. So on the top row, many detector responses plotted over images without any decoding process. And you'll notice over here, there's a chair in the back of the image. There are apparently multiple people over here, a motor car there, and another chair there. If I now rack out all of the detectors that respond and look for some class of consistency in them, I get a person drinking bottle, which I believe, in about the right place. I get a person in about the right place, and a chair in a tolerable place, and the other ones get suppressed. Again, for something like this, lots of people and a sofa. But if I know that there's a sofa there, then I'm more inclined to believe the dog lying on sofa detects, and less inclined to believe the very tiny person detects. These go away, this goes up, and that dog lying on a sofa is also a dog. And it turns out that recognizing that quite complicated things make nice visual chunks of meaning is really quite useful. Okay, now, another thing that my recipe didn't talk about is geometry, and how the geometry of the world affects how you report things. So if you look at a picture like this one, I build a pedestrian detector and I build a car detector with my recipe. Now, my recipe says, look for pedestrians at every location and at every scale. But in fact, in a scene like this, the pedestrian windows that are legal are quite strongly correlated by the fact that the ground is a receding plane. If you want to be a pedestrian up here, you need to be a small window. And if you want to be a pedestrian down here, you can be a big window. And in fact, these are samples of legal pedestrians conditioned on the horizon. legal pedestrians are big down here, they're small up there because of perspective. If they were big up here, they'd be 20 feet tall. What that means is if I can estimate the horizon, I can censor the pedestrian detector responses and come up with ones that are more believable. But if I have a moderately good detector for, say, pedestrians and cars, I might get a hit over here for a pedestrian and a hit over there for a car, and that might tell me where the horizon is. So I can use this reasoning both ways and make a joint estimate. And if I do so, things get significantly better. So over here we have local detect. So the little yellow ones are pedestrians, and you'll notice those vertical windows on the sides of the building give strong pedestrian detector responses. And the little green ones are cars. And the blue is the estimate of the horizon. Now those high pedestrians just simply couldn't exist. They're floating in the air in some way. If we now make a joint estimate and say, look, things that can't be there aren't there, then we come up with detector responses that are much better. That's a plausible pedestrian, although it's on a motorcycle. There, this green one for the car, there, that green motor car. So this geometric constraint really makes a very big difference. Over here again, local detector responses, a car, a pedestrian, more pedestrians, another motor car. The estimated horizon, and then the detector responses that are consistent with that horizon. And you'll see there are rather more things detected over here, and they're rather more accurate. So this observing this kind of global correlation through scene geometry seems to help. There are other kinds of scene geometry that we're capable of estimating, although right now it's hard to build very general detectors with them. So most rooms can be thought of as boxes. And if you think about a room as a box, then you can say the first question you can ask is, can I estimate the box? And it's been known for a long time that if there's nothing in the room, it's easy. But if there's furniture and clutter and stuff in the room, it's kind of hard. So what you do is you look for vanishing points. Those give you an estimate of the rotation of the box. And then you look for corners, and those give you an estimate of the translation. Now you know where the walls are, and you know the color of the walls. So you can then say, this purple stuff is clutter, because it's not the color of the walls, and then you can re-estimate the corners, and that gets you a slightly better estimate of the box. If you have a moderately good estimate of the box, the first thing you can do is figure out where free space is. So I've got the box of the room over there. The purple stuff is clutter. Clutter has to be on the floor. If it's on the floor, it comes up out of the floor. I know how high it is, so then what I can do is estimate the voxels it occupies and then plot them on a rotated view of the room. And this is a moderate estimate of where free space is. This purple stuff is occupied. If you go there, you might bump into something. This stuff is free. That's occupied. Now, that per se doesn't tell you anything about objects. It just tells you about where you can move. But you can also get some information about objects from the room. So over here I've got a room with a bed in it. And I assume that beds are axis aligned. Now I estimate the box of the room. Because I've estimated the box of the room and beds are axis aligned, I can rectify this image so that the face of the bed over here is frontal. It really is a rectangle now, rather than a sort of quadrilateral. If it's now a rectangle, I know I can build a detector that looks for frontal faces of beds in boxes. And then I can do that for the top of the bed and the side. And by doing that, you can build something that is very slightly better than any other bed detector. So if I know where the room is, I can come up with a slightly better bed detector. Now, one difficulty with this is there's not a line of people beating at the door for super good bed detectors. But at the same time, it's an argument that says if you know something about the environment in which objects live, that can help you just a little bit in thinking about what they are. Okay, so the final thing you might want to predict are sentences. And there's some very important subtleties here about object recognition that are only beginning to come to the front now. One is, what is worth saying about a picture? So Julia Hockenmeyer went out and she collected about 5,000 images, and then for each of them she collected 5 sentences. And the remarkable thing about these sentences is they're moderately consistent. And they leave out a lot of stuff. So if you look at these sentences, these ones are all talking about the same thing. They identify about the same thing as being important in the image, and the vast majority of the objects in the image get no mention at all. So the handbags are left out, the sandals are left out, the painted toenails are left out, the specular reflections in the window are left out, the bricks are left out, the pigeon droppings are left out, these structural objects are left out. Most of the objects in the pictures just aren't there. They're ignored. And they're ignored for a pretty good reason, which is they're not that significant. Right? But that poses us with a question. In my recipe, I went and detected objects. But I have to figure out what to detect. And when I look at a picture, I have to figure out what to report. And one possible report might be things like these sentences. The reason these sentences are attractive is they're immensely compact representations of information. There's an awful lot in a short sentence about the objects that are important, the relations between those objects, the important properties of these objects, and what is substantive. So there are two things going on here. One is this very compact representation of information, and the other is selection. We know how to predict some kinds of sentences from some kinds of very structured scene. So some years ago, Abhinav Gupta and colleagues noticed that baseball is a very highly structured game. Certain things happen, and they happen in sequences, and you can think about the game as being built up, if you like, out of a finite state automaton or a bit of surgery on trees. So then you can use my classification recipe to go and figure out where particular actions occur. And once you've figured out where and when particular actions occur in the movie, you can then say, how do I join up the pieces of baseball recipe to represent what I've seen? And if I know how to join up the pieces of baseball recipe to represent what I've seen, generating text is then fairly straightforward. Okay? This text is not compelling baseball commentary, but it's a comprehensive description of what actually happened. Pitcher pitches the ball before batter hits, and then simultaneously batter runs to base, etc. So if you're into language generation, you're laughing up your sleeve at this point, but you'll notice that the information that you need to do a proper job of language generation is there. And that's sort of the important bit. It turns out you can predict rich-ish sentences from really quite simple intermediate representations. Tamara will no doubt talk much more about this, but Ali Fahadi last year basically took images, generated 3 kinds of detector response. One kind of detector response was an object detector, another kind was an action detector, and the third was a scene. And then said, look, the responses of these detectors form a kind of intermediate space, and I'm going to build a metric linking observed sentences to images by a cost that I compute in this intermediate space. And then if I want to attach a sentence to a picture, I'll compute the intermediate representation for the picture, I'll go to each sentence from some list of sentences, I'll compute an intermediate representation from the sentence, and I'll go and find the sentence with the best cost. If I do that, I can get some moderate sentences. Again, the game is changing very fast here, and much better sentences were demonstrated by Tamara and others this year. But over there, we've got a picture. The intermediate estimates look like, pet, sleep, and ground. And the kind of sentences you pick up are cow in the grass field, dog herding sheep in open terrain, cattle feeding at a trough. And these are painful because they're almost there, but they're not right. Right? And that's something you should notice about sentences. They've got so much information in them that predicting them is really very tricky indeed. In the second one, you have this collection of stuff which says refrigerator almost empty, which is almost right, but it isn't. Because it isn't almost empty, it's actually full. Down here, this one is wonderful. For this image, we get a man stands next to a train on a cloudy day, which is almost right. If you zoom the image, which I haven't done, that's actually a woman. But otherwise, it's a great sentence. A backpacker stands beside a green train, well, tolerable. Here, another indication of why sentences are tricky and powerful. A black laptop is connected to a black Dell monitor. Well, it isn't actually a black monitor, it isn't a Dell monitor, and it isn't a laptop. But we're in the sort of general place. So these sentences are full of very detailed information, which is really quite tricky to get right. Tamara and many colleagues just this year, I pinched this from the PDF version of a paper a week ago, showed how you could extend this process by adding some attributes, the attributes roughly in the way that I talked about, and some spatial relations using a conditional random field. And we're able to generate sentences. We're also, you could whine a little bit about the language generation, but clearly there's an understanding of what's going on. Here we see one person and one train. The black person, black clothing, is by the train. There are one dining table, one chair, and two windows. The wooden dining table is by the wooden chair and against the first window and against the second white window. The wooden chair is by the first monitor and by the second white window. The first window is by the second white window. Again, you could fuss about the language generation. People don't speak like this. But the description of what's going on in the picture is now informative and moderately accurate. Okay, so now I want to show you another example of selection, which I find a very important example. It's disturbing. The movie's kind of disturbing, and I can only show it to you because nobody was hurt. It looks as though somebody's going to get badly hurt, but nobody was hurt. Okay, questions at this point? Good. Okay. So fairly obvious what the context of the movie is. It's some security movie. It's appeared on telly, so again, there are limits to how bad it's going to be. Okay, let's stop at that point. How many adults were on the platform? And what were they doing? Right? Well, it seems like kind of a stupid question, right? People mostly get the answer wrong. The answer is 5, and most of them are just standing around. Right? The reason it's a stupid question is if you're watching the movie, your attention is driven by one thing. There's one thing going on, and there's one thing that's important in the movie, and the rest of the stuff just isn't significant. And the important thing is we expect an outcome. We don't like the outcome we expect. And we think about things like how are other people feeling, not because we're warm and fuzzy, although we might be, but because it helps us know what they'll do and how they'll behave. And the big thing that's sort of going through most people's minds at this point is what's going to happen to the baby. Again, selection. You look at it and you say, this is what's important and this is what we need to deal with. The movie itself is pretty wrenching. Again, when you look at a movie like that, how many people are on the platform and what they're doing just isn't an issue. What you're good at is you can make a fairly good prediction that this person is going to behave a bit erratically at this point. She's really just tried to jump in front of a moving train. Okay. The movie itself is an indication of, A, you should always put the brakes on strollers, and B, polypropylene shells are really pretty good. The kid was not lying forward with the shell hanging over it, and the stroller was knocked along the platform, but the child was not damaged. It's popularized in YouTube. You can find it on YouTube and a bunch of other places. It was taken in Australia a couple of years ago now. Okay, so now let's sort of move to open questions. So this question of what you report and why you report that instead of other stuff is open and painful. Okay, so in the recipe I described to you, there is one major difficulty, and that is dataset bias. And by bias I mean frequencies in data may misrepresent the application. Bias is not wickedness. It's not somebody went out and collected a biased data set to make them look good. It's just a fact of life. When you go out and collect a data set of pedestrians, you probably don't see a pedestrian standing in a funny configuration or with one leg in the air or climbing off a bicycle just because you didn't happen to collect that picture. And then you misrepresent the frequency. It's commonly understood in language circles because so many words are rare. That means in turn that your estimate of the frequency of the words that you get is not good for rare words. Why would you get bias in the kind of data sets that I'm talking about? Because the labels are wrong? people just label things wrong. We kind of know how to deal with that. It's not the worst thing in the world. Because of the choice of things to get labeled. So sometimes you might choose red cars to get labeled more than usual cars, and then P of labeled given X is not uniform. It turns out there are mathematical theories for dealing with that. They're not that great, but you could use those. And then there's a form of bias which I think is unavoidable and very seriously problematic, which I think of as curation bias. What gets collected? Pictures from the web, for example, are selected. Bias is pervasive, and it's beginning to be seen as a serious nuisance in computer vision circles. So Teralba and Efros this year published a paper that points out that if you moderately know object recognition, you can look at these pictures and tell which data set they came from. Not only that, you can actually build a computer program which can take a picture from a well-established modern computer vision data set and say which data set it came from. And that's an alarming indicator that our data sets are biased because they're not like each other. If they were unbiased, they would all have the same estimates of frequencies and everything would be fine. But because they're unlike each other, they must be biased. Making a data set big doesn't make bias go away. And in fact, it can make life a problem. So if you have a really large collection of pictures which misrepresents frequencies, you might be confident that you've got the frequencies right in an unjustified way. Why? What's an example? Well, here are the top, I don't know, it looks like about 15 lions from 23 million lion image results. Right? You'll notice something extremely strange about these pictures. Lots of really strange stuff, in fact. 2 lions are riding horses. Right? The second one and this one. One of them is being ridden by a person. Right? This one is cuddling a person through bars. And where's the one that's had this one's had a permanent wave. These are not representative lines. They are weird lines, and they're weird lines. Oh, that one's lying down with a lamb as well, which is another sort of unconventional piece of behavior. These are weird lines, and they're weird because they've been selected. Somebody said, this is a neat picture of a lion. This is an interesting picture of a lion. They've been selected and they're popular, but they're not representative. Anybody know what a representative picture of a lion would look like? Well, the first thing you can say for certain is it would be asleep. Right? Because they spend something like 80 to 90% of their time asleep, as most feline predators do. So, you know, these are not even close to representative. And saying, well, I got my lion pictures from Google doesn't help. They've got millions of them, but they're all weird. Right? And that presents us with very important empirical problems. They're important empirical problems because they blow up the most basic principle of machine learning, which is if the world is like the data set, then future performance will be like training performance. And you can either believe that just as a statement in words, or we can make vague gestures in the direction of Chernoff bounds. This is the belief that the world is like the data set is a fundamental feature of machine learning. We really are not in a position to say we have a biased data set, an unbiased world, this is how things are going to go. So this bias actually blows up what we know about learning if the world can't be like the data set. And the world can't. And the reason it can't be like the data set is objects appear to display the same behavior that words do, which is some objects are common. This is a collection of the frequency of occurrence versus the object number for a data set called Label Me, which has lots and lots of objects in it. So some objects are common. There are a small number of objects where we have 4,000 to 5,000 instances of those objects in the data set. But most objects turn up very few times. So there are 200 objects that appear once or twice. Now, in a world that really is like that, samples that are of moderate or reasonable size are going to misrepresent all of that stuff. Bias is something that just is pervasive and we have to live with. What could we do about bias? Well, the answer to bias seems to be in representation. So, for example, I already showed you one way of avoiding dataset bias. We built a feature representation that was illumination invariant. we took gradient orientations because we said they weren't affected by illumination. That means, in turn, I don't have to show you examples of an object in a fair range of different illuminations. Because illumination doesn't come into my representation, so I don't need to have an unbiased representation in training. Another thing that I could do is build appropriate intermediate representations. So one attraction of an attribute-based representation, if it were true, nobody has demonstrated that this is true, but it might be possible to build something where the object frequencies were very weird, but the attribute frequencies were not. So that you could train the attributes and only then train the objects, and your attribute estimates would be unbiased. And that would be an attractive thing if it were true. Another possibility might be that you could represent knowledge in such a way that helps you against bias. So if you think about the pedestrian example, I was able to get rid of absolutely obviously wrong pedestrians, which will help me with some kinds of bias, by using global geometric knowledge. Okay, so final comments, and then we're almost done. I've talked about one way of thinking about recognition and very important practical consequences and things that we can do. Then I talked about a whole bunch of subtleties and confusions in recognition. And all of these suggest a new way or other ways of thinking about recognition, a new belief space, if you like. One is the belief that object categories are highly fluid. The same object might occupy many different categories at the same time. Categories aren't a natural thing that exists. It's not the case that some divine Platonic principle created the category cup, and this is an instance of the category. We call it a cup because it's convenient. It's a way of generalizing how it will behave. It's a way of understanding what it will do later on. And it may not be right when I throw it. Right? It's not empty enough, but if I turned it upside down and stuck it on my head, you'd agree it was a hat as well. It didn't stop being a cup when it became a hat. It's both. Right? And what that means is the categories help you generalize. If I hold it like that, I can keep a liquid in it, I can do a bunch of other stuff with it, I can pour things from it. If I turn it on my head and it didn't have a liquid in it previously, it would keep the top of my head dry. Right? They're purely functional, and they are related by current problem and utility. If it was raining, I could stick it on my head and I'd think about it as a hat. If I wanted to drink coffee, I'd think about it as a cup and I'd be happy. Instances can belong to many categories simultaneously, as I've demonstrated. At different times, the same instance may belong to different categories. So if I think of this as a cup and then I throw it, you can think of it as a projectile, and possibly I would think of it as a projectile at the same time as well. And it would have turned from being a cup into a projectile. Categories are shaded. So I've shown a bunch of examples where things that you might think of as being statistical within class variation are actually quite principled. The fact that this is a cup without a handle is useful. It's worth knowing. It's not just a statistical nuisance that some of them do have handles and some of them don't. It's a principled internal variation that's valuable. Most categories seem to be rare. Now, there's another worry about categories, which is many categories might very well be personal. I might think about objects and categorize them in ways that are different from the ways you do, because I want to do different things to objects than you want to do to them. Right? That can't be wholly true, because at some point you and I have to agree about how to talk about objects, otherwise confusion will reign. So some categories must be negotiated as well. You and I agree most of the time on what we think is a cup. Not all the time. There's a bunch of work from Lebov about people getting confused between cups and vases, but most of the time. And that means that the way one wants to think about object recognition is as a process of constantly coping with marginally unfamiliar things, categorizing them, trying to make generalizations about them, fitting them into new classes of category, then deciding, well, gee, I want to do this, so all of my categorization decisions have changed, and recognizing that bias is pervasive when I do this. I will not get large numbers of examples of cups simultaneously being used as cups, hats, and projectiles. And when it happens, I just have to cope. Here are some examples of sort of coexisting category systems, because I can't resist. We already did that one. It could be a monkey, it could be a plastic toy, or it could simply be irrelevant. An enormous number of objects have been categorized irrelevant as I talk, and that seems to be just fine. This could be a person or a child or a beer drinker or a beer drinking child or a tourist or a holidaymaker, an obstacle, a potential arrest. I mean, you could get promoted, right? Or irrelevant or. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Okay, so now I've got to the conclusion, as it were. Big points. Recognition is very subtle, but there is a powerful recipe that works really well. There are tremendous subtleties knocking around that are not terribly well understood. What should you say about unfamiliar objects? What kinds of things should you recognize? How does geometry help? How do you produce compact representations of all that's going on? These things are probably addressed by taking that original recipe and rearranging it. So if you think about the attribute stuff I talked about, I said, well, yeah, I'm going to use features and classifiers, but the outputs of my classifiers will mean something different. And if you think about the visual phrases stuff I said essentially, yeah, I'm going to use detector technologies the way I described, but now instead of detecting bicycles, I'll detect people riding bicycles. Geometry says, well, look at that recipe and censor it. And sentences say, well, look at that recipe and build more complex things out of the outputs of the recipe. So the general recipe seems to be fine, but the way in which the pieces are arranged is still very much up for grabs. There are two crucial open questions. One is, how do we live in the presence of biased data sets? And nobody knows the answer to that one. That's just open. And the second one is, how do my categorization attempts link to my utility, my sense of what I'm trying to achieve? If I deal with objects, I need to say, I am trying to do this, therefore that is one of these. And that's the end of it for me. Questions at this point? Please.
So like you mentioned, there's also a distinction between absolute properties and relative properties.
Uh-huh.
With like size.
Okay, okay.
I see how what you're talking about in computer vision relates to absolute properties of records, things that are true of the object.
Right, right.
But is there any work on sort of relative properties comparing an object to similar?
Okay, so relative property stuff is kind of interesting, right? There's a little bit, and it's confused. So the natural place to do this is size. There's a dispute about the extent to which you can get relative size estimates. I don't think I've got the slide here with me, but there's a wonderful slide due to Dan Kirsten of pictures of a man holding a large fish. And in one picture he holds the fish here, and in the other picture he holds the fish there. And then the question is, how big is the fish? And it turns out this one, everybody says this one is the biggest fish. And that's because you don't account for the perspective correctly. Right? It's actually the same fish, just in two configurations. It's Dan's dad and the fish. And Dan's dad, who's been lying about fish for 60 years, knows that if you want your fish photographed, you hold it in front of you. But with that kind of confusion about human things, we know that people are moderately good at absolute size estimates of objects, which could then drive relative. So an absolute size estimate is, this is how big it is. And then the relative one would be, is it big with respect to the usual one, or is it small with respect to the usual one? In the computer vision side, we're not that good at absolute size estimates, which means we don't know all that much about relative size estimates. The other area people have looked at this is in color. Right? Is this of the same color as the usual thing in its class? But again, that gets confused a bit by just straightforward measurement things. The color of the light messes things up, etc., etc. And at the end of the day, we're not very good at saying much of that stuff. I think it'll come, and you could think about what I was saying about the bird with extra leaves as being a stab in the general direction of properties relative to other members of a class, right? But it's still a stab in that direction rather than a resolution. Another thing we don't know very much about is which properties are appropriate to discuss as relative properties. Size and color seem natural, but there might be others. So the short answer is not much is known. A little bit, but not much. Well, you're a little bit ahead of us there, right? So let's see, I'll tell my story of Gibbon. Gibbon, the historian, gives the account of a saint who, with her retinue of 500, had their heads chopped off on the way to Rome. And then they reached up, picked up their heads and walked to Rome. And Gibbon's footnote points out that it's not the journey that's important, it's the first step. So the thing about those visual phrases that's important is the fact that there's one of them is astonishing. After that, it's not that easy. What we've done is been purely opportunistic, which I think is probably the right thing to do. Basically, you take the objects you know about, you stick them into phrases, then you get pictures, recognizing that the longer the phrase, the fewer examples you will get to train with. You train, and you keep the ones that work and declare that those are visual phrases, and the other ones that don't work, you declare are not. It'd be nice to have something more principled. Right, so we do not have a way of saying this will form a visual phrase and that will not. What we do is build a detector, see what happens, and if it does. Now, I don't regard that as desperately distressing because we don't have any notion of the complexity of appearance of an object. So the argument I was making was essentially when you make a composite, sometimes its appearance is less complicated than the appearance of the pieces. And given I don't have a formal way of talking about that, then being formal about what makes a visual phrase is very difficult. That said, opportunism is enough. If you have something that makes things better, it's worth just doing experiments to see which ones have that form. It would be nice to know more. It would be very nice to know more. There's another obvious question here, which nobody's asked, so I'll ask it, which is, aren't you going to get overwhelmed by the fact that there are rather more phrases than there are objects? And I think right now the answer is rather like the answer that people who do phrasal translation use, which is, sure, if I looked at all of the phrases, I'd be in very serious trouble. But if I look at the common ones that help me, then I'm not going to be in trouble. And I think that's our answer as well, although we haven't really got to that kind of scale.
So this business with like birds without wings versus birds with wings that I can't see.
Right.
It seems like the two reasons why you wouldn't be able to see it is either occlusion or it's outside of the frame of the image.
Right.
Is either of those particularly difficult to detect?
I think the answer is no. I mean, the reason we have such crude semantics is we didn't even think there was an issue there. And then, we saw the results and we thought, hey, the way you think about objects is more complicated. So what you should be seeing here, by the way, is sort of an intellectual development in a field. One of the baffling things about modern visual object recognition is people haven't been all that interested in the semantic properties of objects qua objects until very, very recently, right? And what that means in turn is sort of just getting clean on these semantic issues has been remarkably tricky. I guess you probably could do a moderately reasonable job of telling the difference between birds that genuinely didn't have wings and birds where you couldn't see the wings. I think you probably could do that. I don't think anybody's done it, but it looks like something that you could do. Among other things, I mean, there's sort of an obvious recipe here. Once you know that there's an issue, you build something discriminative and see what it does. And that would probably work fairly well.
Okay, so I was going to ask a question about domain adaptation. I think one of the pioneers just is in the room here. But
Right.
So you talked a lot about data set bias, and I'm just wondering if you guys tried anything like domain adaptation?
We know about domain adaptation. We tend to call it transfer learning, which is, just using different words for similar sort of things. Right now it has the reputation of something that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and it's a bit difficult to tell which it's going to be. I would regard it as probably not a magic sauce that you sprinkle on bias problems and they go away, but it's obviously moderately helpful. So its main application in our circles has been to deal with problems of aspect. So there's a significant nuisance with objects, which is when you look at them from different directions, they look different, sometimes very significantly so. If you've seen one object do that, you might be quite good at predicting that behavior for other objects. And then you could use transfer learning or domain adaptation ideas to say, well, I can take my record of the changes on one object and apply them to the other one and use them to recognize that. And that's been moderately successful. You might be able to argue that that would compensate for aspectual biases in dataset structures. The successful transfer learning stuff has mainly very heavily emphasized representation. So, you have to be really careful about your representation, and then it kind of works out. So yeah, we're aware of it. It's good as far as it goes, but it's very difficult to predict how far it's going to go for any particular problem right now. Sort of a summary of our experience. Sounds like we're done.
Thank you.
Berg, and this is going to be a tag team talk between the two Bergs about learning from descriptive text. So, when people describe the visual world or images, they sometimes produce very vivid descriptions. So here the writer says, it was an arresting face, pointed of chin, square of jaw, her eyes were pale green without a touch of hazel, etc., etc. So in general, I think that we can learn things from large pools of visually descriptive text like this to better understand various aspects of the world. So for example, we can do things like get training data for how people construct natural language around images. So how do people describe the world? We can get information about how the world works. So things like, what are the attributes of faces? Can brows they can be bushy, they can be thin, they can be slanted. And lastly, we can also get information to sort of guide where visual recognition should go next, to sort of inform what are the things we should recognize. And David mentioned this earlier. And by the way, you guys should ask questions as we go. Okay, so visually descriptive text like this is somewhat different from what we generally do in object recognition. So in a general object recognition system, we might give a picture like this, and the system might say there's a car here, or there's a person there, or a shoe there, right? But these sort of outputs are much different from the descriptive text a person might write about these images or might say about these images. So looking at these human-generated descriptions can inform where we can go next with visual recognition research. So there's lots of places where we can find images and text together. Things like web pages. So on web pages, you often have text with some associated images. But the connection between the text and the images might be fairly loose, right? So this text is describing giraffes. They're the tallest animal in the world. They can weigh up to 2,000 pounds. But the text isn't directly describing what's happening in this picture, right? It doesn't say there's a giraffe. It's a picture of its head. It's eating a leaf. This is a picture of a giraffe. It's running against some trees. So here the connection between the text and the images is kind of loose. In tagged images, like what you would find on something like Flickr, there are lots and lots of images with associated keywords. And here, sometimes the words describe the content directly. So this tag says there's a frog, there's a finger, a hand, feet, eyes, mouth, etc. So some of the tags are describing what's in the picture. Some of the tags aren't related to the content necessarily. Like it says Canon, Japan, vacation, right? So some of the text is not directly associated with the content of the image. And another thing about tags is that there's not really any structure in them, right? Each tag is sort of individually associated with this picture. And you don't know that, for example, the frog is in the hand or the eye is part of the frog. So overall, we can get some information about how people describe images from tagged images, but maybe not a very deep understanding. In captioned images, the link between the images and the text is going to be quite direct. So if you read this caption, President George W. Bush makes a statement in the Rose Garden while Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld looks on, et cetera, et cetera. Who do you expect to appear in this picture? Bush and Rumsfeld, and you probably assume that Saddam Hussein will not be pictured, right? So here, the caption is basically telling you almost exactly what's going to appear in the picture. So it's a very direct relationship. Here, I guess you guys have seen this caption before, maybe you'll remember. It's the perfect party dress with distinctly feminine details, such as a wide sash bow, empire waist, deep scoop neck, right? So it's telling you not only what's going to appear in the picture, but also some attributes that that object will have. So, right, so here you see what you expected, you know, you see a bow, you see a deep scoop neck, et cetera, et cetera. So in general, captioned images can give you information about what is depicted in images and how people describe things that are in images. So for example, what are the things that are going to be depicted, and what are the attributes or the appearance characteristics those things are going to have. So mining large pools of descriptive text can give you information about how the world works. So for example, what are the attributes of particular objects? We can look at lots and lots of pictures with associated captions and try to predict what are the attributes of, say, a shoe. We can also learn things about the relationships between objects. If we look at lots and lots of text about cars and streets, we can predict what are the common relationships between cars and streets. They're usually on them, perhaps not under them. So some of the themes of my work and what we're going to work on in the workshop this summer are using large pools of descriptive text to learn how people describe the visual world and what text indicates about what you expect. Learn how the world works from descriptive text, maybe something about the attributes of or relationships between objects. And then apply this knowledge to multimodal collections and recognition. So Alex and I are going to talk about a bunch of different projects we've worked on in this area. The first one is on trying to label faces in news photographs. So here you have photographs with very highly stylized captions, and you want to automatically label the faces in those pictures. And then Alex will talk a little bit about some work we've done on attributes, and then I'll talk about our sentence generation work. All right, so this first project on labeling faces in news photographs was partially sort of in the quest to build a more realistic face recognition data set. So a lot of the old face recognition data sets were captured in labs. They were very, they had low variation in terms of expression or pose, for example. So we wanted to collect a more realistic data set. So we went to the web, we went to Yahoo News, and we collected about 500,000 news photographs with associated captions. So here are two examples. In general, you get a lot of actors and actresses, politicians, sports players, people that appear in the news quite a lot. And so I guess the difficulty here is that you have some faces. You might have multiple faces, or you might have one face. You have some names in the caption, and you want to automatically associate a name with each of the faces that you see in the picture. All right, so the input is a bunch of pictures with associated captions, and the output is going to be labeled faces in the pictures. So what do you need to do? You need to be able to pull out the faces. So you can use something like a face detector to automatically detect faces in pictures. You need to detect the names. So you can use a proper name detector to try to find the names in the captions. And then you want to do two things. The first thing is you want to learn what each person looks like. So you want to have some model for what does Donald Rumsfeld look like. So this is going to be an appearance-based model. And then on the language side, you want to have a model of depiction. So you want to know what's the probability that a name is pictured given its context within the caption. So when you read this caption, President George W. Bush makes the statement, you predicted that George Bush and Donald Rumsfeld would be in the picture, right? And you used some cues to do that. Maybe you saw that George Bush was followed by a present tense verb, so he's more likely to be depicted, as is Donald Rumsfeld. Saddam Hussein was not followed by a present tense verb, and his name was towards the end of the caption. So maybe these are all cues that are important for predicting whether a person is going to be depicted. And so we racked up a bunch of cues like that, things like the part of speech tags of words near the name, things like the location in the caption, distance to certain depiction cues like L, C, and R, which caption writers use to tell you that the person is in the picture and where they are. And so as I said, we're doing two things. We're learning what each person looks like and this depiction model across all names. Right? And we can achieve both of these things by considering a large assignment problem, where you have some large number of face detections. Each detection has multiple associated names. And you're basically running a big clustering problem to figure out which name should go with each face. Right? So for each image, you have some set of detected names, detected faces. Here we have 2 faces. Some set of detected names, John Furlong and Winter Olympics. Right? And here are all the possible assignments of names to faces, where if a face is assigned to null, that means that they weren't mentioned in the caption. And if a name is assigned to null, that means they weren't depicted in the picture. Right? So your job is to pick the best assignment for each data item. And you're going to do this all at the same time by considering a big clustering problem. One neat thing you can do is you can look at how much is this language or depiction model helping you. Is it helping you at all? Well, it turns out that it does help quite a bit. So if you don't use a language model at all, the accuracy of your face labeling is something like 67%. And you get almost or more than a 10% boost by considering this model of depiction. Right? So you can fix things like this face being assigned to CEO Summit. Once you look at the context of CEO Summit, the model realizes that it's a very unlikely context for depiction. So it switches this face to Martha Stewart. You can also do things like take this depiction model that you've learned over your data and run it on captions without any pictures at all and predict who's going to appear in the picture. So here it predicts that Pete Sampras will be in this picture, US Open will not. That's correct. I think this last one is incorrect. Stephen Joseph, this shown above, should probably have tipped it off, but it didn't. Yeah. So you can do pretty well at predicting who's going to be in a picture without ever looking at the picture at all. And one neat thing that we built is a face dictionary. Let me see if, oops. Where we can basically browse the news according to who's depicted in the picture. Where's the link? There we go. So each of these faces is a person or a name. Oh. Sorry. So each of these faces is a person in our data set. And you can basically, this is very weird, click on a face to see all of the faces that were assigned to this name. In this case, it's Bill Gates. And then you can click on one of the faces to go back to the original picture and caption. Sorry, it's not appearing on my computer, so this is very difficult. And so it turns out that this was a much more realistic face recognition data set than the ones that had been built before. It was much more challenging. You get a very large range of poses and expressions and lighting conditions, which is what makes it so difficult to recognize. There are about 30,000 faces in it and about 5,000 different individuals. Let's see if we can find George Bush. Once in a while, you'll get multiple captions that correspond to the same person if they're referred to by different names. So if you have George Bush and you have President Bush, you might have two clusters that actually refer to the same person. Oh, this is not. And sometimes you get a mistake. So here, this one's labeled as George Washington. Not quite correct. So it's about 80% accurate, which is not too bad. All right. Okay, so that was a project where we were looking at this idea of combining both appearance to do recognition and also this idea of trying to build a model of depiction. All right. Okay, and Alex is going to talk about attributes next. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so hi, I'm Alex, and we're going to sort of continue with a theme here, right? So Tamara was talking about names and faces, but really this is a specific instance of what people can do with words and pictures. And David was talking a lot about various things with words and pictures earlier as well. And the other thing that we're going to continue in this theme is that we're not going to look at these for generic objects, right? We're going to be talking about, Tamara was talking about words and pictures for faces, right? And we're going to be talking about attributes, which David mentioned again earlier, but specifically about faces. In both cases, these are really the first pieces of work on the computer vision side where people really got these things to work in some sort of tangible way, where you could measure on an application and say, oh, look, the performance using these techniques is better. And it's not a coincidence that these are both looking at faces. These are some of the most studied things on the computer vision side, right? I guess if you look at biology, the Drosophila of computer vision are faces, right? These are the things that everyone does. They're really basic experiments on. So what are we talking about here? Like people were saying earlier, attributes are something we can use to describe things. Maybe they're more flexible than looking at category labels. I can look at a bunch of faces and look at the ones that are female, wearing eyeglasses, middle-aged, and having dark hair, right? And we can narrow this down to one person. You can look at this with an entirely different set of descriptors, Caucasian, teeth showing, pictured outside, and with, I guess, a tilted head. And you'll notice a few things here. Once, this is reinforcing the idea that categories can be an awkward way to talk about recognition. So for instance, I would need to have a very, very complex structure of categories to get down to this level of specificity, right? You could think about an obvious way to talk about categories for people as, people's names, right? So I could have a big library of people's names, and then I would have to go a lot further down. I'd have to say, well, pictures of Joanne, or whatever her name is, outside, pictures of her inside, pictures of her with the flash illumination, pictures of her with, natural light, pictures of her with her teeth showing. So it doesn't really make sense to talk about a discrete vocabulary of categories. And this is one of the attractive things about thinking about recognition in terms of attributes. So we also have a practical problem in face recognition. It's a general instance of what's difficult in recognition in computer vision, which is sometimes different things look similar. Right? And they look similar because of various confounding factors like illumination, pose. For instance, if you see a photo of me in the same pose as these guys, I probably look more similar to them than I do to me in a completely different pose. So in some sense, you look, people look more similar to each other than they do to themselves looking to the side. This is one of the things that makes recognition in vision difficult. All right, so this is some work with a bunch of folks at Columbia. And the basic idea is, as opposed to a lot of basic recognition techniques in computer vision, where you start with some input image, compute features, compare these features to decide if these two images are similar. Instead, we're going to explicitly try to recognize whether these two are men, and they're both not men. We'll recognize whether they're Asian, and one is Asian and one is not. Whether they have dark hair, and one has a round jaw and one doesn't. So I guess Tina Fey does not have a round jaw, and whoever this is does. And based on those attributes, we'll say, well, these aren't the same person, right? And so what this work is showing is that, it is actually possible to do well at this task of deciding, are these two the same person, by explicitly estimating attributes. Now, obviously, you could imagine, let's see, this woman's head is tilted, this one isn't. That's an attribute that you can estimate about the faces, but it's not important for whether they're the same person or not. Right? It might be important for some other task where you're trying to find images of people with their heads tilted, but it's not important for identity. Right? So David alluded to this a little bit earlier, but one of the nice things about looking at attributes is it gives you another way to look at things, right? So I could just say, give you a whole bunch of examples of pairs of people and say, here are two pictures of the same person, here are two pictures of different people, here are two pictures of the same person, here are two pictures of different people. By looking at attributes, you get an additional type of data, which says, this person is Asian, right? And you might be able to get a less biased version of this. No matter what, I'm going to have to pick some population of people. I'm going to have to pick pairs of them that are the same, pairs of them that are different. There's potential bias in selecting this type of data. You might be able to avoid that bias, or at least get more complete sampling over some space of labels by looking at an alternate version of labeling your data. Also, you can think about attributes at many different levels of specificity. So, for instance, relatively coarse scale things like face shape, relatively fine scale things like mole on left cheek. You can have a whole range at the level of specificity with which you refer to attributes of people's faces. So, one thing that we're sort of brushing under the rug, and I think we've brushed under the rug in all the discussion so far, is where these labels come from and what kinds of labels we're talking about. So all the stuff we've shown you for faces here are things that you can write down in words, right? And this has a really nice consequence, which is that you can go off to Mechanical Turk, and I think you've all seen Mechanical Turk? Yes, yes, yes. So a small set of people aren't nodding their heads. That's okay. So you can go out to Mechanical Turk and you can ask people, click on the faces that are smiling. Everybody can do this. People around the world can do this. Even if you don't really understand a lot of English, you can click on the faces that are smiling pretty easily. Right? So because these are describable visual attributes of faces, you can have people label them very inexpensively on Mechanical Turk. Yeah, so here's an actual example of this. Let's see. Click on the faces where the eyewear is eyeglasses. Here's some examples of people with eyeglasses. Mechanical Turk workers have to click on the ones with eyeglasses. And they can do this very accurately, very cheaply. You'll do things where you'll want multiple labelers to agree on a label. Here's some examples. So it's pretty consistent. They all have glasses. The people where nobody labeled them as having glasses don't have glasses. It's a relatively easy task. Even when the labelers are unsure, these in fact actually all have glasses. People are surprisingly good at this. So how do we use these labels? This is a relatively simple, straightforward idea here, right? You've gone out to Mechanical Turk, you've got labeled people who are Asian, labeled people who are not Asian, and And you just train a classifier to distinguish that set from that set, or blonde-haired from not blonde-haired, or male from not male. Now again, there's a reason this is on faces. Faces are something special. We know how to detect faces in images, right? And for this work, we also know how to rectify faces. So I can detect a face and I can tell you where the eyes are, where the nose is, where the mouth is, approximately where the hair is. This is the kind of stuff that works relatively well in computer vision. There are a lot of other things where, things work, but they're not super accurate. Face detection is something that actually works really consistently on, lots and lots of data. Mainly frontal faces, but still, it's consistent enough to actually build systems on top of. Right? So if we wanted to, for instance, build a classifier for blonde versus not blonde, first we'll detect the faces. We'll be able to tell where hair is, where the face is, where the eyes are. And we'll be able to search for features that help distinguish these two sets, the set of blonde people from the set of non-blonde people. And hopefully whatever machine learning technique we use will automatically tell that you should look at the hair region to be able to distinguish these two sets. That's kind of a neat thing. You can actually search over spatially, which features are important for making the distinction. Maybe you can look at whether color features or texture features matter for making this distinction. So far we've talked about just simple describable attributes of people's faces, but there are other things, that for instance we use to describe faces that might not work as well for mechanical Turk labeling. And so we could describe this woman as female, young, attractive, white, black hair, frontal pose, mouth closed, eyes open. But we could also say that she has eyes like Penelope Cruz. And I'm just going to say Niraj Kumar was the grad student who came up with this example. That she has lips like Angelina Jolie. And we refer to these as simile attributes. Right? So you could train these by collecting a whole bunch of pictures of Penelope Cruz, looking at her eyes, a whole bunch of other people looking at their eyes, and train a classifier to distinguish between her eyes and somebody else's eyes. And then you could say, where does Alex Berg fit on the eyes like Penelope Cruz spectrum? And he's probably on this side of the spectrum as opposed to that side. Right? So that would be an attribute you could use to describe me. His eyes look nothing like Penelope Cruz. Right, but you could also use this to compare, these are two pictures of Harrison Ford. When I compare the eyes in pictures 1 to reference person 1's eyes, I say, well, they're not much like reference person 1's eyes, and they're not much like reference person 1's eyes in either picture. Right, so it might be a useful attribute for telling whether it's a photo of the same person. So how does this do? The data set that Tamara was talking about collecting in the previous part of the talk, we're actually going to look at a subset of that data set for evaluation. And so what we're looking at here is, given a pair of photos, how accurately are you in saying whether they're photos of the same person or photos of a different person? And we're above 80-20, right? So you have true positives above 80%. False positives below 20%. This is very good performance. And the thing I was getting excited about earlier is this is the first time you saw an attribute-based approach where you're explicitly estimating attributes and using those as your intermediate features to actually do better than the previous state of the art on some relatively well-studied vision problem. And that's, again, not a coincidence that this was on faces. Right? Now, to put this in perspective, and this is something that's kind of fun to do with computer vision in general, how well does this work? Right? So, for instance, how well can people do at telling whether two photos show the same person? So you ask people, do these two photos show the same person? And you can sort of see where that performance curve is. All right, they're effectively 100%. I think 99.2% accuracy. No false positives, all true positives. You say, what if I show you a more closely cropped version of this? You're getting some information from the background there. So what if I show you this? What's the guess for how well people do? You say, well, it goes down a little bit. They're still ridiculously accurate. right? And this is the information that the computer vision algorithm gets to look at. It doesn't get to look at this background. It only gets to look at the face. This is maybe a fair comparison. So 87% to 97%. It's still a big shift. The funny thing, and this I think really gets to, oh yeah, go ahead.
So your human face verification was on the data sets that we were talking about. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But all of those photographs are of famous people.
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question. You might think that, these guys look a little different. I think these are taken many years apart, but I know they're both Robert Redford, which I think is correct. So obviously it doesn't help all of us all the time. And we actually explicitly studied this. So we said, tell me whether you recognize the person in each photo, and then tell me whether they're the same person. And it basically doesn't help you to recognize the person. Another thing is we've chosen to show pictures of celebrities that are relatively recognizable. There are maybe 1,000 individuals in this, and I certainly don't know 1,000 celebrities, especially obscure European politicians, who sometimes are less obscure, sometimes more obscure, but so I don't recognize many of the people in the data set. Yeah.
Is there a reason that the computer doesn't pick the person's hair to look like?
Yeah, so hair is big, and they do get some. They get hair in basically this region, and basically it's because face detection works pretty well, right? Face alignment works approximately, but this idea of, for instance, you have hair that extends outside of your immediate head region, and this actually gets to be a little bit trickier. Other people have hair that extends below their immediate hair region. It gets to be a little trickier to figure out where the hair region is, and it would be neat if we could do that much more accurately. Certainly, for helping people recognize other people, hair is very important. So one of the funny things you can do is you can show people not the face. They do get to see some hair in this example, and they do surprisingly well. And I think this is really about dataset bias. So it's saying that the scene in which they're photographed, or maybe their clothing, is highly correlated with who the person is. So for instance, actors, this is a perfectly reasonable background. If I'm a politician, I might expect to be in front of an American flag in front of a podium. If I'm a basketball player, I'm on a basketball court. Right? So you have a pretty big correlation between the type of celebrity you are and what environment you're photographed in. And there can be information here. All right, so this is just going over results over the years on this data set again. We'll skip this. So one of the take-home messages here is if you can go out and collect additional labels about things, it's very helpful. So as we said, we can collect labels about these things because they're describable. I can write down in a few words, does this person have high cheekbones? Right? But there are other types of things that we can label that aren't as easily describable in words. So for instance, we can have people click on joints. So here we're clicking on a wrist, an elbow, a shoulder. We can have them, move stick figures over a person, maybe label a segment in an image. These are all things that you can collect labels for relatively easily. You're taking advantage of the fact that some tasks are easy for people, and you can collect labels for various things. And if this information might be useful for some recognition task, you can train intermediate detectors or classifiers to recognize those things that you can label. Open questions are, what types of things should we be labeling? Right? So here we're talking about things inside this person. Right? So, at somehow a smaller spatial scale than the whole person. David was talking earlier about, well, I might want to look at the person interacting with their environment and look at chunks of that as the things to label and recognize. So again, so far we've sort of just said these are the things we're going to try to detect. We're going to try to detect brown-haired guys. We're going to try to detect people wearing glasses. But you might want to figure out automatically what kinds of attributes are important for a particular application. And we're going to get back to shoes. This is definitely work with Tamara. Here are some descriptions from product websites for shoes. In fact, I think these are all for that shoe, but I'm not sure I could tell. So what kinds of things do people describe? They describe the shape of the toe. I think pump refers to the type of shoe. Creamy leather. Shoes are creamy. So we want to learn which attributes in descriptions are depictable. So some of these things I might actually be able to, I might expect that I could actually predict from the image, and other things I might not. So for instance, alluring might be tricky, megawatt might be tricky. Red sole, I might be able to actually say, red, I could maybe detect that. We'd like to sort of automatically find which of these attributes are actually depicted. And so we go out and, mine the internet for product images with descriptions, a huge set of these. And we'd like to learn that you could describe shoes by referring to whether they have an ankle strap or not, whether they're red, whether they have a high heel. We could learn that high heel is in this part of that image, that it's something that's localized on the shoe, that the color red is something that's around the entire shoe. So we're characterizing these attributes. So you can learn all of this by a big collection of images and text. So here's an example of words and pictures that's not involving faces, but there are a few things that make it relatively easy. So these are product images. They're nicely segmented from the background. The descriptions, as Tamara was saying earlier, there are different levels of specificity in the connection between words and pictures. Here, at least the descriptions are for these products. The language might not be very relevant to the visual depiction of the products, and we're trying to learn which bits of that language are relevant to the visual depiction. But, it's not talking about Frank who's not pictured. It's talking about these earrings. All right, so there are some things that still make make us expect that we might be able to succeed at this. And there are a lot of reasons why you might want to do that. So how do you proceed? Well, just rack up a bunch of pictures of earrings that had a particular word. Let's say hoop. Consider all possible words, strings of words. So here are earrings that had the word hoop in their description. Here are earrings that don't have the word hoop in their description. And, well, we notice a couple things that are a little bit funny. So these are supposed to be hoop earrings. These are supposed to be not hoop earrings. And I think that's a hoop earring. All right. So you immediately see there's some noise in this data. All right. So one of the keys here is when you're automatically collecting this data from the interweb, you're going to have different types of noise. Right? So here, the negatives are not necessarily negatives. Most of the positives are, in fact, positive. I think those are round, but I'm not quite sure if I would call them hoops. But most of these are actual examples of hoop earrings. So given slightly noisy data, we'd like to try to train a classifier to distinguish between hoop earrings from non-hoop earrings. And then we'll test it on some other data. Right? We'll say, let's say, I'm going to train using the top 2 rows of data and evaluate on the bottom 2 rows and see how well I did at predicting whether hoop was in the description for a pair of earrings. And if I can do well at that prediction task based on this training, then maybe hoop is something that's at least visually discernible to the computer vision algorithms that I have. All right, so here's an example of tie images with navy in their description and tie images without navy in their description. And you could say, am I going to be able to train a classifier which hopefully is going to automatically choose to look at color features instead of shape features to tell the difference between this set and this set? So how well does this work? So here are precision recall curves for some of these classifiers. Now remember, none of this data is hand labeled. Right? All of these labels came from whether the word was in the description or the word wasn't in the description. Right? So the labels themselves are noisy, but something like a front platform, which is a type of shoe that has a big front platform, it's sort of very visibly salient, and that's the kind of thing you can predict really accurately. Right? Oh yeah, so here are front platform shoes, very visually salient. Round sandals. So a word like appeal is much less visibly discernible to, at least to our computer vision algorithms. So these are shoes that had the word appeal in their description, maybe. So it's a little less clear what that means visually. And so you've automatically ranked some words, sequences of 2 or 3 words, as to whether they're very visual or not. You've automatically identified visual attributes. So for handbags, clutch and hobo are visually discernible, and essentials are not. And here's some examples. So clutch is on top, sort of very visually consistent. Hobo is here, visually consistent. Looks like something about the shape of the handbags. And something like essentials across the bottom is not particularly visual. So how am I doing on time? Okay. So one thing is that people refer to, so the word tote and the word straps refer to the same thing in shoes. Oh, sorry, in handbags. So these things are correlated. If I try to train classifiers for their visual appearance, the output of those classifiers is very consistent. So you can find these basically visual synsets. And we'd also like to characterize what the attribute words are referring to. So if I say round sandals, is that referring to color, shape, or texture? And it's pretty easy to say that if I train a classifier based on color, I'm not good at predicting whether something was labeled with round sandals. If I train a classifier based on shape, I am good at predicting whether something was described as having round sandals. So you can say perhaps round sandals is based on shape. All right. You could also say for something like ankle strap, which is the strap around the ankle at the top of a shoe, I could try to train a local classifier that looks at just a little chunk of the image at a time and tries to classify, is there an ankle strap or not? Right? And it turns out that you can train a local classifier, right? Basically like one of these sliding window detectors for ankle straps, that works relatively well. So ankle strap is something that is localized on the shoe. And so you can characterize it as being a local attribute, again, based on shape. Right. So here's some examples of sandal style round, right? It's very localizable. The front of the sandal is round. Something like stiletto is very localizable, based on shape again, and it's on the back of the shoe. Something like striped, not localizable. Gold, blue, sort of obvious things like color that are spread out over the objects are not very localizable. So we have another transition. So one of the main intents here is not to impose our high-level knowledge on what things we expect to find. We'd like to automatically figure out that things like pretty and appeal are not especially visual, and things like red and off. We'd like to be able to find this automatically. I think, obviously, if you had a bunch of people interested in what words they thought were important for describing visual appearance, they could probably do pretty well. We'd like to see what we can do automatically.
Oh, and also we didn't really do anything on the language side. So in that project, we basically considered any sort of commonly occurring string to be a possible attribute. So you could do something smarter on the language side. You could say, well, adjectives are probably attributes, and verbs are probably not attributes, for example.
But of course, what's
things
hobo?
like that. What's hobo? What is? Oh, I guess hobo has multiple meanings. So yeah. So if it was it could be a person or a. Yeah, so I guess sort of what we did in that was complementary to what you could do on the language side. And if you added those two things together, you could probably do a much better job. Yeah. Any other questions for Alex before we move on? Okay, so the last thing we were going to talk about is on trying to automatically generate sentences for images. And David talked about this a little bit earlier. So basically, we're going to use sort of state-of-the-art recognition modules and some text priors that we collected from large pools of descriptive text to automatically generate sentences for images. And so this was a paper called Baby Talk with a bunch of co-authors at Stony Brook. So in this paper, we demonstrate a method to generate sentences. So for this image, we generate a sentence that says, this picture shows one person, one grass, one chair, and one potted plant. The person is near the green grass and in the chair. So the person's not actually in the chair, but it's sort of a reasonable interpretation given these two detection windows and given what we know about people and chairs, right? So the person is near the green grass and in the chair. The green grass is by the chair and near the potted plant, right? So you can sort of see why we called it Baby Talk. It's sort of a very naive description of the image, but it sort of tells you approximately what's in that image, at least given what we can detect at this point. So how could you generate such a description? Well, there's been a little bit of work on generating descriptions for images or generating captions. Some of the people in NLP have focused on sort of summarizing existing text fragments associated with an image. So Acker et al. Use GPS metadata to access relevant documents for an image, and then they summarize those into a caption. Feng and Lapata assume that you're given an image with an associated document already, and your job is to summarize the document to create a caption. David has worked on this a little, and he talked about his a little bit. So here they're trying to retrieve descriptions from a collection. Right, so as compared to these other approaches, we're trying to generate captions essentially from scratch, based on what we can recognize in an image. So of course, since we're computer vision people, the first thing we want to do is let's try some state-of-the-art detection and classification predictions, right? So we can figure out what can we recognize in images. Maybe we could just generate a caption based on those things. But it turns out that it's really useful to also include statistics that we can get from parsing lots and lots of descriptive text, right? So this will tell us what things are common or what things are usual, and that can help us do better at recognition. So in this paper, we collected information from descriptive text for two things. We collected information about what are the possible or common attributes of objects. Right, so you can learn that grass is usually green, cars can be shiny, right? And you can also learn about the relationships between objects. That cats are often on sofas, people are often in chairs. Right, and so we can use a combination of our vision recognition outputs and text statistics and use those both together to predict the best image labeling for an image, right? And then we can use some very simple generation algorithms to compose natural language based on those predictions. So here's what it looks like. If you're given an input image, you can try to predict what are the objects in that image by running a bunch of object detectors on the image. So in this case, we predict there's a dog in this image, there's a person, and there's a sofa, right? For each of those objects, we can try to predict what are the possible attributes. So in particular, this dog is probably furry, this sofa is probably brown, right? Based on some classifier of appearance. For pairs of objects, we can try to predict what are the possible relationships or spatial prepositions between those objects. So maybe the dog is near the sofa, the person is on the sofa. And then we can put all of this together into a CRF and come up with the best predicted labeling of the image given both our vision predictions and our text statistics. So here we've labeled it as null person, so person without an attribute against brown sofa, dog near person, dog beside brown sofa. Right? And then, of course, once you get to this point, you actually have to generate a sentence. So we can use some very simple generation methods to produce, this is a photograph of one person and one brown sofa and one dog. The person is against the brown sofa, and the dog is near the person and beside the brown sofa. So as I mentioned, we use a CRF to do this, so it has a bunch of potentials. We have some, so the way we construct this graph is if we run all of our object detectors on the image, we have some set of detections. So we have one node per object detection, or cluster of detections if you have a lot of overlapping detections. For each object node, you have an associated attribute node, which tells you what, if any, modifier term should be associated with that object. And between every pair of objects, we have a prepositional node denoting spatial relationships. So on or under, for example. And so we have a bunch of different potentials. Some of them come from the vision predictions. Some of them come from our text potentials. So the first vision potential is for objects or stuff. So if we have an image, we might detect some objects in that image. So we use, I guess David talked about this earlier too, so we use this part-based detector, which is sort of the most common detector being used out there right now, for 24 different categories, things like dogs, cows, chairs, horses, windows, flowers, etc. Right? So we have some kinds of objects like that, like dogs and cats, right? We have other kinds of objects in the world which don't necessarily have parts, right? So grass doesn't necessarily have any parts, sky, water, right? So we can't use a part-based detector for these kinds of object categories. We call them stuff. So for the stuff, we use sort of more of a sliding window-based detector based on predicting the class for a particular region. And we use a variety of features, things like color-based features, texture-based features, and those hog descriptors, which David showed pictures of earlier with the oriented local orientations. For the attributes of objects, we define another potential, which sort of predicts what are the modifier terms for a particular object. So again, this is an SVM-based classifier, and we predict a variety of different kinds of attributes, mostly based on color, texture, some shape like rectangular, or some general appearance characteristics like rusty or wooden. The prepositions are very simple. So basically you can predict a possible preposition between two objects based on just the locations of their detection windows, right? You could do something more complicated if you actually knew the 3D structure of the scene, but we're not going that far. We're just sort of saying, well, if this window is here and this one is here, it's likely that this one is on this one. On the text side, we're trying to learn what are the common attributes for different objects. So how often are dogs brown? How often are they striped? How often are they furry? Right? And so we can learn this from lots and lots of parsed text. So we do this for about 50,000 Flickr descriptions that we collected for each object category. Right? And then we parsed them using the Stanford dependency parser and looked for A-mod relationships between objects and attributes. So here, for example, you have an A-mod relationship between car and black. Right? And so we collect lots and lots of these statistics, and we learn what are the common attributes for different objects. Right? So we do this for two things. We want to know what are the probabilities for shiny airplanes. And we also want to know what are the attributes we should train classifiers for. Right? So we can collect lots and lots of descriptive text, and we can say, let's find a set of attributes that covers our objects well and for which we can train classifiers. Our last potential is a trinary potential between object-object prepositions, right? So we want to say, what are the common relationships between dogs and persons? Well, they can be near them, they can be against them, they can be beside them. Right? And so again, we go to the web and we find lots and lots of descriptive text. We parse it and we look for places where you have this prepositional relationship between two objects. All right, so putting all of this together, we get outputs like the one you saw earlier, person against brown sofa, dog near person, dog beside brown sofa. And then, of course, we need to turn this into a natural language description. So we have two different methods for that. One is a very simple decoding-based model where we're just sort of trying to insert functional words between our content words. And the second one is also very simple. It's a sort of a fill-in-the-blanks template approach where we assume that there are sort of a handful of syntactic patterns in descriptive language that we can encode as templates for generation. And so that produces results like these. This is a photograph of one furry sheep, or the furry sheep, etc. So here are some results. There are one cow and one sky. The golden cow is by the blue sky. There are two airplanes. The first shiny airplane is near the second shiny airplane. This is a picture of one sky, one road, and one sheep. The gray sky is over the gray road. The gray sheep is by the gray road. Here we see one road, one sky, and one bicycle. The road is near the blue sky and near the colorful bicycle. And the colorful bicycle is within the blue sky. So you get some relatively reasonable results. They might not be exactly how a human would describe the image, but they do give you some idea of what's in the image. Of course, it doesn't always work. There are lots of ways that something like this can fail. For example, you can miss detections. So here, we've missed detecting this bird, and so it just says, here we see one potted plant. Here, I believe we've missed detecting, I think it's a cat, but it could be a dog. Sometimes you get false detections. So here, we have detected a furry road in our furry cat. Or sometimes you can mislabel an attribute. Right? So here we've described these horses as being feathered. Of course they're not. There are no feathered horses. In a case like this, you would hope that the language model would be able to tell you that there are no feathered horses. But in this particular example, it wasn't quite strong enough, I guess. Another thing that you see is that sometimes in descriptive text, certain attributes are very common for an object. And it's not necessarily a reflection of how often that occurs. Right? So in this example, we're saying that all of these sheep are black. Right? Because you see the phrase black sheep everywhere in text, right? And that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the color of the sheep. Or how often black sheep occur versus white sheep. Some other things that are difficult are things like counting. So here we say this is a picture of 4 persons. I guess there actually is a 4th person, but I don't think we detected them. So here we see 2 cows in 1 person. I think this cow over here is just being detected as part of that person. And sometimes you just go completely wrong. So here, this is a photograph of 1 person and 1 sky. The white person is by the blue sky. Who knows? All right. So one thing you ask yourself when you're doing something like this is, how are we going to evaluate something like this? It's really tough, right? It's a very subjective thing, right? But one thing you can think about is that what we're doing is sort of like translating between images and text. right? We're trying to produce a translation of this image into words, right? So we could maybe use something like the BLEU score, like what people use in machine translation, to evaluate the n-gram precision of machine-generated sentences versus human-generated sentences, right? So if you have a bunch of human-generated sentences, we're using the UIUC Pascal dataset from Julia Hockenmeyer. So here you have 3 human sentences for this image. One person says, a lemonade stand is manned by a blonde child with a cookie. The second person says, a small child at a lemonade and cookie stand on a city corner. And the third person says, young child behind lemonade stand eating a cookie, right? So one thing you can notice between these human-generated sentences is that there's quite a lot of variation in how a person describes this image, right? So it might be that the BLEU score is not exactly the best measure for evaluation. But nevertheless, we can try to do that. So we can look at the BLEU score between our sentences and human-generated sentences. Oh, so by the way, the BLEU score between 2 human-generated sentences is about 0.5. And we can do reasonably well at predicting or at this evaluation task. Another thing we did is we asked people to sort of basically just evaluate our sentences. You're given an image and a sentence, and you're going to rate it between 1 and 4, where 4 is a perfect sentence for the image, and 1 is a total failure. But we can do pretty reasonably. People evaluate our sentences to be pretty good. All right. Okay, so in conclusion, after all of these projects, we've shown that you can sort of make use of state-of-the-art visual recognition detectors and classifiers to do things like label faces or generate sentences for images. It's very useful to sort of try to learn from descriptive text about how the world works, how people describe the world, and maybe something about what we should recognize in computer vision. And if you combine these vision and text inputs, you can do better at recognition, understanding what's in images, predicting what people might say about images. Great. Any questions for me or Alex?
So I was thinking about the evaluation part. So I believe Julia Hirschberg at Columbia has a system called WordZai, where you can type a description and it will generate an image of that. So can you use that for evaluation? Because the image itself was generated from the text. My guess is that it wouldn't have all of the additional stuff that a regular image.
So how would you use that for evaluation? So that project is you type in a description and it generates a synthetic image, right? So they have some graphics models of objects, and they can put them in places and they can locate them. And so how would you use that to evaluate whether you got it? Would you compare that generation to your original picture?
No, it was, so could you compare the, could you run your system on the image to see if you're getting text similar to the description?
Oh, I see. On the synthetic image.
Yeah. I was just,
Well, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but for example, the reason I was saying you could use synthetic images is because in real images you could have things like the background is white, things like that, which your system might capture, and that is true, but people might not write that down. Whereas synthetic images it just won't have anything that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could try it. I mean, but you wouldn't need most of the recognition part of the system, right? Because for a synthetic object, you can basically recognize it, right? Because you produced it properly. Yeah. One thing we have tried in more recent work is another evaluation method, which is basically I give you 2 images and I give you a sentence that we generated. And you have to associate the sentence with one of those images. How accurately can you do that? So that's sort of an objective measure of how good is the sentence that's coming out.
So there's another stumbling bit here, which is there doesn't seem to be any resource of information which tells you what things are usually like visually. There's no place you would go to look up the fact that the sky tends to be blue, but sometimes red, and the grass is green, but sometimes brown.
The ones that I described here, but for the other ones where we were actually asking people to associate the caption with an image we were. And they do a really good job. I was surprised that they were actually pretty careful.
In your CRF system, just see if I understand it correctly, like you said you're doing like an object detection sort of as a first stage, and then
You
you
build
go ahead and
the,
build the graph. So does your system have an opportunity to sort of go back on that decision and say, well, there's an object here, but any possible relationship just looks ridiculous. So, or are you forced to like make a relationship between all the objects that you've detected? You know what I mean?
no, it can say null. It can say, well, this object is really unlikely. I'll just assign it to the label null for that node of the zero. And you saw that a lot for the attributes. Like it would just come out with null instead of any particular attribute. I don't know how often that occurs, but
and does the granularity of the description that you are generating depend on the task that you're using in the description for? I'm just wondering why it's so, why the description is so precise sometimes. Like why do you have to say there are 2 cows or something like that? Would it sound more natural if you say?
yes, definitely. So these descriptions are very unnatural, right? So one of the things we want to work on this summer is how can we generate things that are more human. So when a human sees a picture or a video, they really only describe a few things that are very important to that picture. Right? And we haven't done any of that here. But that's something we want to work on in the next few weeks. Or at least start working on. I think it's a very difficult problem in general. Did you guys have any answers to that?
I agree with what you said. One thing